Hi, this is Greg Kilstrom. Welcome to Season 3 of the Agile World, where we discuss customer and employee experience, organizational and workforce transformation, and how business can adapt and continually improve in an agile age. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed in this show, you can go to my website at theagile.world and read my latest articles, or get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kilstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile World podcast. Today we're going to talk about the power of customer and employee stories to create great customer experiences. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Gabrielle Dolan, speaker, founder of Jargon Free Fridays, and author of the book Magnetic Stories. Gabrielle, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Greg. I'm really excited to be here.
Great. Yeah, looking forward to talking. So let's get started by talking about the power of stories and customer experience. Can you talk a little bit about your approach when finding a good story that a brand can use to enhance its CX?
Yeah, so one of the things I talk about when it comes to a good story or a brand story is I try to encourage people it's not just one story. So a lot of the times I have clients come to me to say, can you help us develop our brand story? And I go, there's lots of brand stories. So my approach is looking at all the different types of stories you can share to communicate and to, I guess, enhance that customer experience. In my latest book that you spoke about, Magnetic Stories, I talk about the 5 different types of stories, but one specifically is, stories around your culture or your values that can actually really when the customer sort of feels a bit of a loyalty to the brand through the stories you've shared.
Yeah. So what do you think it is about stories that is so effective in helping create these customer experiences?
Yeah, well, I guess it's looking predominantly of why stories are so effective. So, I mean, stories can do a lot as well as creating a great customer experience. But there's a lot of research that shows that, when we hear stories, we have this emotional connection to. So we relate to the story, but we also relate to the storyteller. So there's all this research that shows that as humans, yes, we want logical information, we want data, but ultimately we're emotional beings. So we relate more effectively to stories. So we not only, I see a lot of people, good storytellers, whether they're sharing stories to their employees or to their customers, it not only helps get the message across, but it actually strengthens the relationship between the storyteller and the person receiving the story.
Yeah, and I would imagine it helps them remember it better. It makes it a little more personal, right? Is that what you
Yeah,
think?
absolutely. It's one of the powers of story is, and if you've ever experienced that feeling of why don't they get this? It makes such logical sense.
Right.
My advice is we'll try sharing it through a story because through the story people not only understand the message more effectively, or they understand it better, but they actually remember it, and they could potentially retell other people the story. So, and that's really important when it comes to customers, because if you create a great experience for one customer, they can sort of become your brand ambassadors, but it's the story that they can continually share.
Yeah, that makes sense. Could you give an example of a story? How that made a positive impact on a brand.
Yeah, look, in one of the things I loved writing my latest book is I got to speak to so many companies from around the world that were doing just really amazing things with stories and sharing their stories. And again, it's not just one story, obviously, but it's lots of stories. One of the to give an American example, I interviewed Columbia Restaurants in Florida, which was one of the oldest restaurants in Florida, and they do amazing stuff with story. So they use story on their menu, they use story on their website, they use story in their wine list, they use stories as part of their induction program, and they use stories on their social media. And one little, like, this is just a little specific example of I guess a customer story, is that they share stories about their customers but make the customers the hero. But one example was in Valentine's Day. last year. They put a story on their social media on Facebook, and it was about a couple that had celebrated their wedding anniversary at the Columbia restaurant for 72 years. And they talked about how they came to the restaurant for their first wedding anniversary, and they came back on their second wedding anniversary and coincidentally were seated at the same table. So
Oh,
for the next 70 years, Columbia Restaurant reserved that table for them, and they came to that restaurant. And Columbia Restaurants just sort of shared that story to say, we celebrate love on Valentine's Day and stuff like that, making them the hero. But by default, you sort of you're sort of listening to that and going, wow, that's a really cool thing that restaurant's done. And it must be pretty special that people keep coming back to it. So I think that's a great example of a great customer experience story. And I've had so many people read my book, from around the world, and have said, first thing when borders open, I'm going to the Columbia restaurant. So it's creating that connection to the brand.
yeah, and I mean, that's so much more memorable and just, emotional than them saying we love our customer. I mean, sure, I'm sure they say that in one way or the other, but it's in a way it's kind of proving it, right?
Yeah, and that's what the story does. The story provides the proof, not just saying, you know, like that could easily be shared a story, go, oh, our customers love us. We have customers coming back for 72 years. And it's sort of that's sort of factual information, but it's the story that creates the connection and creates the social proof.
So how do you measure a good story? Like, in other words, like what makes a good story, and how do you determine that it's being successful? It's not like website visits or clicks on ads or something. Like how do you measure that it's being effective?
Yeah, and look, sometimes, like a lot of things, sometimes these are hard to measure. But I think the ultimate test of a really good story and how you measure it is when people retell it. So if people are retelling the story, that is ultimately what you want out of a story. Now that can is clearly hard to measure. So that's like anecdotal evidence. I did have one of the companies I spoke about in the book is a company from Melbourne, Australia, and they're called Goodwill Wine. And I interviewed the CEO who founded the company about 10 years ago when he'd lost his entire, you know, life and not life, but property and everything from a massive bushfire. And with the funding, he started this wine company where he donates 50% of all profits to charities. And he has this story on his website about how he started and the good things they're doing. As the company grew, he was sort of thought he should stop sharing his story, that the company was getting bigger than him, but the people encouraged him to do it as a bit of a test. They used to run commercials. They did commercial adverts on social media, and as a bit of a test, one of the ads they wrote was just his story. They literally put that on the story, and he said that ad alone got it like 3 times more traffic to the website. So there are ways you can measure it, but it's stuff like that. And I know anecdotally, I write a blog every week, and the blogs when I write stories and write personal stories, they get the most comments, they get the most traction, they get the most shares and likes. So you can measure it that way.
Let's talk a little bit. I know we touched a bit on your book, but let's talk a little more specifically. And just what was your reason for writing the book, and what are the main insights you want people to get from it?
Yeah, it's a good question, Greg. Every time I write a book, I sort of think, that's I've written enough on storytelling. Like there's only so much you can write on storytelling in business, and that was certainly the case when I wrote my last book. But what I started to notice was that a lot of people were talking about brand storytelling recently, and they were doing a couple of things. They were sort of saying, "This is our brand story," and when I'd look at it, I would go, "But that's not a story. It's a timeline, or it's a slick corporate video, but it's actually not a story." And I'd also be, as I said before, it's not just one story. And I also, came across people that had amazing stories that weren't sharing them, and they weren't sharing them because they either didn't know how, or they didn't think people would be interested, or they just didn't understand the power of sharing the story. So that was the catalyst to write the book, to help people. And I guess when you talk about what would you want your reader to get out of it, I sort of hope that the reader gets out of it clarity that what actually is brand storytelling. So what is storytelling, why it's powerful, and why they should use it. I hope they get knowledge out of it. So I do talk about the 5 types of stories that you should use when you're running a business, and I also talk about how you could implement brand storytelling. But I think most of I hope they get inspiration to do it. Like I said, I got the opportunity to speak to some amazing companies from around the world that have amazing stories and are sharing them in a really good way. So so I hope they get clarity. I hope get they knowledge, but inspiration to actually give it a go themselves.
That's great. What are some of the maybe misunderstandings or some reasons for apprehension when brands are considering a story based? Like why might they not do it, and what would you say to them to to talk some sense into them?
Yeah. Yeah, look, there's still a lot of people that think, business is very professional, and so we have this like bias towards facts and figures. So there's still a lot of people that think that if we provide the logic, so the logic of a good product or the logic of our service, that people will buy from us because it makes logical sense, and that's just not the reality. And again, the science proves all this, that as
Yeah.
humans we are emotional beings, and any good salesperson will tell you that we buy on emotion and we justify on logic. And whether that's buying a pair of shoes or the latest iPhone, or buying into a company, like buying into the values or strategy or purpose of a company, we buy into that on emotion and we justify on logic. So I think that's one of the reasons people just are really dismissive of the role emotion plays when we're trying when in as humans, when we're trying to influence people. I think also it comes down to I see a lot of companies and they think, but no one would be interested in my story, so they just don't
Mm.
understand the power of story. I remember speaking to a woman a couple of years ago, and she used to be a dentist, but she owns a whole lot of childcare centres. And I remember just talking to her over dinner, saying, "Wow, that's a pretty big jump going from a dentist to owning childcare centres. What made you move?" And she told me the story that she had, her and her husband had tried to get pregnant for a very long time, and they eventually did. And when they went to put their son into a childcare, she just wasn't happy with any of the childcare centres she looked at. She just wasn't prepared to leave her son in a place that
Yeah.
he didn't love. So she decided to buy one and turned it into this place that he would love. And she said, every decision we make is based on, would my son love this? And that's how we run our business. And I just remember looking at her and go, please tell me that story is front and center on your website. Because if I was looking for a childcare center, I would just read that story and say, sign me up, sign me up.
Yeah.
And she didn't, because she sort of said, oh no, we use it internally, but it's probably not appropriate to put on the website. It was like, oh, it's so is appropriate. But again, so I
Yeah.
think I think that's the reluctance, why people aren't sharing stories, because they just don't understand the absolute power that stories have.
Yeah. So, you mentioned just then an owner's story. You've mentioned the customer story from the restaurant. How do employee stories factor into the approach, and can they be as compelling for customers to hear?
Yeah, they can. So one of the I think one of the real powerful stories is sharing stories of your employees either doing really good things in the community or actually living and breathing the values of the company. So those stories are really powerful induction programs. So if one of your values, or what you want to be known for as a business, say for example, is exceptional customer service, then to get your employees living customer service, to get your employees delivering exceptional customer service, you've got to provide them with lots of stories of previous employees doing it so they actually fully understand what that means. I remember, I came across this story years and years ago, but it was from Nordstrom's. I'm sure a lot of your audience may already know it, from
Yeah.
1975, when a man who had brought tires from a tire shop came back to get a refund of the tires, and in between, the tire shop had closed down and a brand new Nordstrom store was in its place. But the sales assistant gave him a full refund of the tires, even though Nordstrom don't even sell tires.
Oh wow, I haven't heard that
Yeah,
one.
and so that story that happened in 1975, and it's still being spoken about today. Like,
Yeah.
if so, this comes, and Nordstrom were really good at using like this story, but lots and lots of stories in their induction process, which any new employee goes, oh right, that's what exceptional customer service means. That I just go above and beyond what I would normally do to provide exceptional customer service. So if you do a Google search on that Nordstrom tires story, there's over like 7 million views the last time I did it. So
Wow.
it's the power of a story. Now, if you spoke to the sales assistant, the sales assistant didn't do it to create a story. They just did it because that was the expected behavior. If you had said to him, in 46 years, people will still be talking about this story, and
Right.
and you're going to go viral on the internet and have all these Google searches, they would no doubt say, what's Google and what's the internet? It's like-
Right. Yeah, no, that's and that makes it real. I mean, to your point, that makes everybody hears about Nordstrom customer service and stuff like that, but that really makes it real for other companies, and maybe not as established in that realm or of customer service. Like, what can a company do to help? Because it takes two parties in that scenario of like the employees have the stories, especially the dedicated ones, I'm sure do. What can the company provide to those employees to give them a better understanding of, like, yes, like we're looking for whatever it is, XYZ.
Yeah, yeah, Greg. So that's to me. So I sort of I talk about this 5-step approach to implementing brand story, and the first step is sort of what you've defined. What is what is it we want to be known for? So, do we want to be known for exceptional customer service? Do we want to be known for integrity? Do we want to be known for innovative? Do we want to be known for easy to deal with? So the first step is you have to actually define what you want your brand to be. So a lot of companies do this. They call them values, for example, but don't really then embed them as much. So the first step is defining what you want them to be. I think the second most important step, and this is overlooked a lot, is you need to educate your employees around brand storytelling and the role they can play. So, for example, not only helping them find and share stories, but also helping them understand that what they do creates stories. So that education process is really, really critical, and how they can share stories well, because you don't want to be sharing a story and taking 5 minutes to do it. And then that education process starts what is like a cyclical process of 3 things, where you collect the stories, you communicate them, and you create them. And it starts this ongoing cycle of someone doing something well. Let's make sure all our employees know about it, they can communicate it, and then they create stories. One of Going back to the Columbia restaurant, they don't only just share stories about their customers, they don't only just share stories about their employees, but they'll have backstory. So they've got this, like, massive chandelier in the foyer, and there's a backstory to that. The wine, the bakery, they use the bakery, they've been using the same bakery for over 100 years, and there's a story behind that. And what they do is they make sure every single one of their employees knows that story, so when they're talking to the customer, they can tell that story. Which, again, when you talk about enhancing a customer experience, if you're just eating a simple bread roll, but you hear the story about how this company has been using the bakery for 100 years, and how the great grandfather knew the great grandfather of that bakery, it enhances the customer experiences. So it takes it just from a a meal to an experience.
Well, one last question before we wrap up. As a fellow author, I always like to ask this question. So, about the process of writing. So, this wasn't your first book, as you mentioned, but what were there some things that you learned on the process, or some things that you would do differently, or just any learnings from writing this book?
Yeah, look, this is my sixth book, and I must admit, every time I write a book, it does get a little bit easier. So I think the first book I wrote, it took years and years, and I sat on it. What I tend to do is I come up with the idea, and I do speak to my publisher to see if it's sort of
Right.
worthy. Um, and what I tend to do now, and I've done this for the last couple of books, is before I used to just sit down and write, but this time I sort of map things out and I collect all my ideas and I collect potential stories I could use, and then I start writing. And I don't know if this is with you, Greg. I get to a certain point. It's normally about the 15,000 word mark, which is, books need to
Yeah.
be, 50 type thousand words. And I think, okay, I don't think I've got anything else to say. And that's when
Yeah.
I reached out to all these companies and literally shared their stories. So in fact,
Cool.
I had someone read my book, and they said, you can tell that you like really loved writing this book. And I think that was true, because it never at any time felt like, sometimes you can get writer's block and you can get stumped. But I felt that because it's so full of other people's stories that inspired me, it was quite easy to write. It also did help.
Yeah.
I'm in Melbourne, Australia, and like a lot of people around the world, we were in lockdown over COVID.
Right.
So
Right.
it's sort of been, at some stage we weren't allowed to leave our house for more than 5 kilometers, and only allowed to leave the house for 1 hour to exercise and go to the shop for essential items. So it'd be fair to say there was a lot of time to write.
Yeah, yeah, I know. A lot of people find ways to, or at least used to, like lock themselves somewhere in a cabin somewhere to write. But I
Yeah,
think at
we
least there was that. We
yeah.
had a little more time to write.
We did. When I first started writing the book, I actually thought it was perfect timing, because I'm an international speaker, so I had a couple of trips to America booked in. I had a trip to London, and I actually do a lot of good writing on planes or at airports where
Yeah,
you're not distracted. So I thought it was perfect timing, but clearly all those flights didn't happen. But a lockdown
yeah.
helped.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I definitely share. I do a lot of writing on, or I did a lot of writing on planes. I probably will soon again as well. But yeah, I share the that it's funny you mentioned like the 15,000 word mark, and I do think there's just something interesting in the creative process, and you've written several books. Same here, and it does get easier, but there is always that like point of I at least for me, there's a point of frustration, or a point where now that I know better, I know I'm going to get past it. But
Mm,
the first one, I was just kind of like stuck, and I was like, oh my god, why did I write a book in the first place? Now it's just like I know that, okay, well, I'm going to get past it, but I need, it's just part of the kind of creative process, and I think that's an interesting phenomena to kind of understand, and just have the patience to know that you will get through it, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Greg, and maybe that's why I talked about I really enjoyed this book and I didn't get frustrated or stuck, because I think you come to the realization that's part of the process, that I have this sort of little joke with my editor that says what happens in the first draft stays in the first draft, because I was just like,
Right.
only she will know how bad that was.
I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
And I think also
Wonderful.
too, Greg, it's finding the writing process that works for you. So for me, I'm very creative first thing in the morning. So I would get up early, write for a couple of hours. The kids would get up for school. I'd get them off. I'd write again. I'd go to gym, like go for a run or something, and then write again. And it's only in the afternoon I would go back and edit and stuff. So I
Yeah.
think for me, it's separating writing and editing as two completely different tasks, and don't try to do them at the same time.
Yeah, I like that. That's it yeah, there's certain, and I know what you're saying about times of day. I have certain days where, like Sundays for instance, I write a lot because there's just no distractions and stuff like that. And it's it's good. Some of it is just kind of knowing yourself and knowing your
Hmm.
what you do best when and all those kinds of things. So yeah, it's good to hear. And you having done a few of these books, it sounds like you probably learned, by the third, fourth, fifth, you're like getting honing your process, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining the show. For those listening, what's the best way for them to keep up with what you're doing?
Yeah, the best way is on LinkedIn or my website, so gabrielledolan.com. So if you go to the website, there's a lot of free stuff on storytelling. You can access my books, of course, but there is a 7-day storytelling starter kit, so that's free. You can download that. So if you're just thinking of, how do I get started on stories, that, as it said, might be a good way to get started. So yeah, gabrielledolan.com.
Wonderful. Well, again, I'd like to thank Gabrielle Dolan, speaker, author, founder of Jargon Free Fridays, and author of Magnetic Stories, for joining the show. Thanks again for listening to The Agile World with Greg Kilstrom. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the Agile World podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. I'm your host, Greg Kilstrom. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can learn more and get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, from my website at theagile.world.